thank you so much for the invitation. Sophia, you've outdone yourself. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's very humbling to be here with all of you today. And thank you for also, Gordon, thank you for putting in this whole kind of notion of scenography forward, because it is in fact like we share a space. So I thought, you know, it might be like a nice intro to kind of start talking about the implicitness of ourselves as cultural producers within these kind of questionings of authority as well. And I work with, of course, you've seen the show. So I work with archives a lot, and I kind of like try to kind of trace kind of historical ready-mades and kind of like bring them together in new formulations of kind of theatrical setups and devices. So I wanted to guide you through a selection of thoughts and some projects that focus on illusionist tactics of soft power that nation building ascribes to cultural production. So this idea of, you know, how we are all kind of implicit, complicit, and what can be done with that? How can we activate this complicitness? So I wanted to question the relationship between culture and national and supranational authority. And of course, soft power, I'm sure we all know, but just to go back to Josephine, so this idea of soft power being this persuasive approach to international relations that typically involves, of course, the use of economic and cultural influence. And what I like to play with in my works is this notion of culture being a tool within coercion of citizens and the international audience alike. So I like to return to this image quite a bit, which is, I think, a nicest illustration of what my practice tries to do. And this was the first summit of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in 1961, which was, so not, the non-aligned was a third way sort of situation set up for the countries that did not want to align themselves with either the Eastern or Western Bloc. And it's this kind of shadowing or mirroring, if you want, of the heads of state in the carpet that I want to talk about. And this idea of how politics is reflected in the design of the scenography that surrounds it. And this is where we the cultural producers, come into play. But of course, the question remains of what happens when the client disappears. So whether it's the non-aligned or some other ideology or kind of national, supranational formation, when they disappear, when these works and architectures that have been created to announce these situations, when they remain, what happens to them? And can they be reactivated in any way apart from them just becoming kind of empty pedestals and frames and so on? So I wanted to show you this image in particular because it's also one of the images that kind of is embedded within the landscape that surrounds us. So this was a series of monuments that the Yugoslav state started working on in the late 1960s when nationalism was kind of starting to bubble in former Yugoslavia. So this was a time when the Yugoslav diplomacy and politicians decided to not pour any more money into external presentations, so world trade fairs, expos, and so on, but to focus on consolidating the idea of the citizens. And it was a series of monuments that were to celebrate the anti-fascist movement and the partisan fight in former Yugoslavia. And this is how this very same monument is depicted today. So it's the image of it from last year's MoMA exhibition, which was celebrating and mapping Yugoslav modernism. And I started calling this little kind of historical remapping apocalyptic weather conditions, because I've been grown quite tired of these kind of geopolitical exoticist moments within the kind of art market mechanisms, and I think this is a really nice example of what happens when a sculpture or architecture does not even move ground, but it is transported with an illusionist tactic of kind of reconfiguring the very light conditions even of the territory, and kind of makes it look alien and other and desirable. So I wanted to quickly go to Spielraum, which was a project that I worked on in 2015, so it's quite an older project. But Spielraum in itself is a really interesting word, I thought, to speak about today. So it comes from German. It's a word that is quite slippery in translation, so it means scope, margin, place to maneuver. So like if you put something in a drawer, is the space where that thing kind of can wiggle, but it's also the wiggle room of critical thought, in my opinion. And it was also an essay by Karl Kraus, who was contemporary of Adolf Loos, actually. He lived in Vienna. And he was arguing against decoration not only as Adolf Loos in design, but also against decoration in language. So here we come to political rhetoric. So I wanted to use build as a lens through which to observe nation building and the instrumentalization of visual language rhetorics, architecture, in the construction of status spectacles. So, are these decoration strategies? Do they kind of produce sort of kind of ornamental rational ideology? Are they obfuscating, or can they also reveal? Or, if we're looking at, through a kind of historical lens, can we unpick these reveal kind of instances as well? So, My Spielraum was a 3-chapter film and research project which focused on 3 moments of a new language that has to announce and represent a new ideology or a national formation, nation state, if we're talking about states. And I wanted to look at, the conditions that make this language kind of basically become, so the birth, and then the running room when the language is established and what that means and how that functions, and then the death. Of what happens when the language effectively loses this client, loses the essence of what is it to represent, and what happens then. And the entire visual basis of the project was taken from the plans for the city of Belgrade, so during the first conference of the Non-Aligned. And this is one of them. There's the book should be, I think, in the reading area as well. So we were lucky enough to be able to access these archives that are held in the Archive of Yugoslavia. So these were like designs and plans by artists and architects. None of these were realized because, of course, it was a completely bankrupt country. Again, these were like archives that nobody was really looking at or accessing. And the problem with the archives in Belgrade is that they keep on disappearing. So I tend to work with a group of researchers, with Docomomo Serbia as well. And whenever we get some funding, we try to go to the archive, digitize, upload to Dropboxes, and send to the virtual archives. And yeah, we were talking about this, how to also, what is then the relationship of the artists, working with such methods. And this is another interesting one from that series, which is the Museum of Revolution, which was, again, never realized. Only its pillars were. So this is the foundation. So this is on the right-hand side. This is the situation today. And underneath these foundations, so underneath the foundations of the Museum of Revolution, there are homeless families that live. So we're actually really kind of talking about these historical ready-mades, but they are extremely affecting the kind of contemporary conditions. So the first chapter of my project was called The Nation Loves It. And the script presented a public address that described the laying of a foundation stone for a fictitious architecture that is to represent this non-disclosed ideology. So it's kind of like really abstraction with these kind of, found fragments of reality. And I composed it from different fragments of speeches across the European space by ideologues that were all extremely involved with the urbanist built space. So effectively their speeches constructed the world as we have it today. So, this was, from Nikita Khrushchev to Margaret Thatcher, of course, Prince Charles, Mitterrand, and so on. So I worked on this script with Tim Etchells, and there was this idea as well of this, these kind of positive affirmations that all the politicians kind of use before the act of the construction of this new ideal, and the words of enticement of how we should all behave and what we should all do to achieve this new idea of an ideal society. And also another interesting thing with Spielraum was that I really wanted to kind of engage with institutions and territories where new censorships were happening. So The Nation Loves It was actually presented at the Ludwig Museum in Budapest, and this was just after Orban changed all the directors in all the cultural institutions for right-wing directors. And Barnabas was let go, who's the chief curator at Ludwig, and all the curators kind of left with him, apart from Rona Kupecki, who then invited invited me to present this. So she was like the only curator left, and she said, but you must realize that nobody will come to the opening because everybody's boycotting the museum. And, I accepted the challenge. I said, let's really play with it, and also kind of really say, what is at stake in these situations, and how, who is your public and who are we speaking to and how. So the second chapter took place in Ljubljana at the International Graphic Center, and it was titled Give Expression to Common Desires, which is a quote from a Harry Truman speech for the laying of the cornerstone of the United Nations building in 1947. And this was a chapter that really wanted to look at this kind of running space. So when this language it has to kind of announce and represent is kind of like up and running, how does it work? So this was a series of performances within these architectural trailers, I would call them, the ceiling above, where the rules of the game were only known to the performers themselves. So there was this kind of actions of like very clear geometric combinations that kind of seemed like they make sense, but you couldn't crack the code, as to say. And I'm talking about architecture trailers here because so these were always kind of foyers for films as well. So the second room would be then the film. And this idea of an expanded sort of experience as well kind of really entered my mind. And I really wanted to kind of like take the moving image forward and really kind of try to make it, try to really connect sort of, again, media and architecture, which is, of course, kind of from Beatrice Colomina onwards, a debate that, we all know. But the ceiling that you saw is a ceiling that is drafted from this building. So this is the former Palace of Federation, Belgrade. And it's a ceiling which was, which still is, it's adorning the main staircase where the diplomats would arrive to this first conference of the non-aligned. So again, this idea, we're kind of here again looking at, panopticon devices, so architecture as like a complete sort of mechanism of authority that sort of delegates, what is worth of looking at and how the, behavioral patterns of the audience should run. And so this was my film Tear Down and Rebuild, which is downstairs, which was filmed within this building, which is kind of a time capsule, really. So it's a modernist palace that kind of has lost all its functions because all its rooms are named, they actually changed names recently, but they were named after republics of former Yugoslavia. And of course, the Serbian politicians refused to use the Bosnian room or the Croatian room and so on. What was really quite phenomenal as well was that all the artworks, all the two-dimensional artworks in the building are actually extremely avant-garde. So this is 1961. This was opened. The build was started in 1947. So the two-dimensional works are like really, really avant-garde. But all the sculpture works are of female nudes, but not just female nudes, but like highly eroticized female nudes, which was kind of quite a kind of stark difference. And in the first chapter of Spielraum, one was kind of listening to these kind of effectively affirmative kind of affirmations of building this perfect new society. So this chapter is looking at the words of enticement to demolition. And again, I wanted to look across the space of tearing down, so different instances when something doesn't fit anymore. So the script is composed of sole quotes on tearing down. But again, we have like a multitude of kind of ideologies coexisting, and I think it goes up to probably the latest ones are quotes from ISIS fighters on the kind of tearing down of Palmyra temples. So the idea really was to kind of use this moment of the non-aligned and former Yugoslavia, sort of, after the Second World War, as a kind of theatrical device, if you want, within which then, different entries of, different kind of case studies kind of entered and appeared. And if I'm speaking about illusions, there's this whole kind of idea that, I've been kind of, as an artist, I'm usually kind of called in to ignite somebody else's cultural capital. And I've kind of found that not problematic per se if you know how to deal with it, or if you're, there's always this kind of question between self-delusion, self-awareness, and, how do we enter this space of debate or this play or double game, if you want. So I really like to, kind of, not necessarily cynically, but, in an aware mode, play with this. As Spielraum was kind of like looking at this idea of this construction of the language itself, I also wanted to look at just these kind of like the first instances of, this kind of moments of camouflage where, the kind of elements of nation-state presentations really kind of come to the foreground. And I kind of you know, it's kind of these kind of past moments of kind of conceptual birthing of soft power in a way that I quite enjoy. And I kind of started looking at expos because they were in a way the first forerunner to the European cities of culture in terms of, you know, how art or culture is presented in terms of sort of national production or ideological production as well. And this was an interesting one. So 1929 Barcelona Expo was organized by the Spanish king because he was losing power and he wanted to just throw kind of bread and circuses, light some lights, make some kind of water fountains light up, and it didn't work for him. But I found this really quite interesting case study of this kind of almost disappeared pavilion of one of the countries, and that was former Yugoslavia, actually the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, that also kept changing its name. So it changed its name during the expo itself, which didn't really help it in terms of PR. But it was. It's this kind of structure that completely sort of disappeared from archives, and it was just very odd because there was a legend going around in Serbia that the architect won the first award, and then Mies van der Rohe came up, and he was kind of going from every jury member to another, trying to overturn the decision. Now, fact or fiction, probably, you know, disgruntled Serbians, but it kind of shows what is at stake, right? So the 1929 Barcelona Expo is really known for the German pavilion, of course. And, you know, I'm sure loads of you have it in your head. It's the kind of very, very barren, modernist building that didn't have a program even. It only inaugurated the symbolic handshake of the Spanish king and the Germans, you know. So it's kind of this kind of first performative kind of architectural situation in a way as well, speaking about kind of political interaction. But the brief for the architect for the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was a traditional Serbian peasant house. And this is what he did. And I was kind of thinking, well, what does one do with this? Because it's kind of quite a bonkers story, and I thought, you know, there's just so much that, you know, what one can kind of like pull apart and question. I mean, not even kind of mentioning the kind of the obligatory land of plenty, the kind of female nude on the right-hand side, because at that point, every single pavilion had the obligatory female nude. To announce it. And this idea of the female body in architecture kind of started really kind of poking out for me, like as a kind of quite a big kind of rich territory to look at, you know, because as a female body had to represent the nation state, so seduce and protect at the same time, this kind of irreconcilable moment is kind of shared with the architectural space as well. So I just wanted to kind of show you like a little assemblage of these kind of fallen kind of mother nations, or like you know, kind of past sort of national kind of representations. So and they're kind of drawn from, obviously, you know, from Finland to Mother Russia and so on. But this idea of this representation and the kind of the likeliness or the, you know, comparative structures between the female body and architecture was kind of, yeah, kind of quite central to this project. And then, of course, you know, as one sees the Brashavan Pavilion, you automatically think of the Adolf Loos house for Josephine Baker. And this is where I kind of really wanted to kind of put this project forward. And this is where I kind of come to these ideas of camouflage techniques, because the facades that they shared are also then shared with the the designs that Norman Wilkinson was using for his razzle-dazzle camouflage. So this kind of stripy facade, and it all kind of turns around in the same year. So we're talking about kind of 1920s, and the razzle-dazzle was a bit earlier, but it's a kind of a camouflage tactic, which was, I was told I have more time. I was told to expand. Okay, I can hurry. I can always expand. Okay, I'll cut back. Yeah, so the Josephine Baker house was kind of built around this pool where Josephine was supposed to be swimming naked whilst being observed by the men in the kind of upper salons drinking coffee. So it was a total tower of control. And again, you know, on one hand, Brashavan had to represent a nation state, and Loos had to represent sort of kind of an emblem of desire by every single white European man. So this kind of like merging of the two, of this kind of how does one build desire between this female body and the nation state, kind of culminated in this project, where I kind of like traced, based on all these kind of found lacking architectures, kind of this lost pavilion as a kind of performative structure, which was then kind of built up by five female dancers. And my work really kind of analyzed specific cases of architecture that performs as a site for political action, but also tool for expression of political thought, really. So I'm always looking at buildings that choreograph acts and interactions, and by their mere articulation as an isolated element that's somehow suspended between scenography, prop, and object, they will discuss the rituals of the spectacle of state. So this was a film which was part of my NADA project, which looked exactly into the metaphors of choreography, conducting, and other dedications of behavioral tactics that were carried out by state authority. And it was a three-chapter film, the exhibition project, that explored various instances of employment of modernism as a political tool in the 20th century. Three key conflicts, so the first, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And this second chapter, at its core, had the reworking of a Bela Bartok ballet, which was choreographed as Mandarin. And this was a central artwork that represented Yugoslavia at the Brussels Expo in 1958. And the plot of the ballet presents a prostitute that three pimps use to lure and execute rich men, basically, until they encounter this exotic foreign Mandarin who just doesn't want to die, so he keeps on coming back alive. So I kind of repurposed this ballet and kind of rewrote it because, of course, there were no traces again, and I kind of like reframed the prostitute as Mother Nation, and the Mandarin, the exotic foreigner, as the artist and the architect who always keeps up coming from the dead and kind of reignites somebody else's cultural capital. And again, we worked with archives, with very kind of fragmented archives, and everything that was missing was kind of taken from nationalist painting and representations of the female body. And I worked with Lee Anderson on the choreography to kind of like retrace this and put it into the Arne Jacobsen Town Hall, where we filmed, which is this kind of amazing Paramount panopticon device in terms of delegation of the users. And just the last slide. So this is the current project that I'm working on, which is also partly presented here, and I'm just delighted to have Cooper Gallery involved in this mastodon undertaking. And it's a fun project. It's probably the closest I came to like kind of performativity of absence, because the project is actually filmed within architectures which were all political gifts. So you can imagine the access is quite brutal. So this is the Niemeyer building in Paris. So this is the French Communist headquarters, which was a gift by Oscar Niemeyer, by the architect himself, after the right-wing political putsch in Brazil, and then he kind of eloped to France, and the French communists were just at that time looking for somebody to kind of reformat their aesthetic space. And the second space we filmed at, and that's the part that is also you're going to see later, we're just going to quickly show it, 7-minute second chapter of The Gift, was filmed at the Palace of Nations, which was built for the League of Nations in Geneva, which was composed from gifts of member states and the city of Geneva. And we have a few others to add, but it's kind of one of those projects where we go like, bear with us whilst we collect our funding. And I kind of like The Gift sort of really wanted to kind of investigate, you know, these stories, but also within them kind of like embed this, the narrative, which is of 4 fundamental freedoms that are characters drafted from a Roosevelt speech on trying to get America to enter the Second World War. And these 4 freedoms stage this fictitious competition for the perfect gift for a divided nation. And the 3 gifts in the film are 3 men, 3 male allegories of art, architecture, and music, who try to compete with the idea of what their perfect gift will be. And I will just quickly play you a little 1-minute clip.
Your proposal must inject a new philosophy. We do not want to